before we start, I wanted to play two radio ads that were played just recently, within the past few days, in New York City and also today in the Jersey Shore, which ended a half an hour ago, for 4 different stations.
I'm Diane Sare, and I'm an independent candidate for governor of New Jersey. Next to my name on the ballot, you'll see 3 words: Glass-Steagall now. You may wonder what a federal banking law has to do with state government. Ever heard of Detroit? The people of Detroit are about to lose their pensions to Wall Street as the city is taken over by a financial dictatorship. Ever heard of Camden, New Jersey? If you don't want to live under a financial dictatorship with genocidal consequences, as can be seen in Greece and Spain, Glass-Steagall must be reinstated now. Governor Christie and his good friend Barack Obama disagree with me on this important issue, which makes both of them unfit to hold office, especially in the face of the biggest financial blowout in history coming our way soon. Tell your congressman that we need Glass-Steagall reinstated now and vote Diane Sare for governor in November. I'm Diane Sare, and I approve this message. I'm Diane Sare, LaRouche Independent for New Jersey Governor. We are approaching the 1st anniversary of the 9/11 attack on our consulate in Benghazi and the 12th anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. Both former President Bush and current President Obama have refused to release the 28 pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry of 9/11, which, according to former U.S. Senator Bob Graham, deal with Saudi funding and coordination of the 2001 terrorist attacks. Instead, these attacks have become the pretext for illegal wars and now the NSA dragnet wiretapping of the American people, which Governor Christie also supports. 674 New Jerseyans died on September 11, 2001, and 11 of the hijackers spent time in Paterson. Any responsible governor of New Jersey would demand the release of these 28 pages and an end to the cover-up of both 9/11 attacks. I and my running mate Bruce Todd want the truth on the Anglo-Saudi role in 9/11. No more cover-ups. This message has been authorized and paid for by Diane Sare for governor.
Good. Now, imagine how many people sun-soaked, sunbathing on the beaches today on the Jersey Shore, or maybe at Atlantic City gambling, listening to this radio ad, or even people that were walking down in Manhattan, right? That's what they heard. And so you can imagine what kind of an effect that created, right? And so I'm going to go just briefly, just to open this event, with what we're going to be looking at in the near future, what we can expect. So just the other day, some people not know the Executive Intelligence Review, or Mr. Lyndon LaRouche's publication. We have Paul Gallagher, who put out an article on Glass-Steagall that was posted on the Oklahoman. Well, after which they put out an attack on this article, which I kind of wanted to just give a little snippet here of this person, Michael Hunter, who put out the attack op-ed into the Oklahoman in response to Paul Gallagher's call for Glass-Steagall. He's saying, Paul Gallagher's call to revive the 80-year-old Glass-Steagall Act propagates a number of unfortunate myths about the American economy and banking system, allowing bank holding companies to build diversified businesses and lending securities, insurances, and other sectors strengthened our financial systems. The biggest firms to fail or to be bailed out during the 2008 financial crisis, Lehman Brothers, AIG, weren't traditional banks at all. Had Glass-Steagall remained in place, even more investment banks would likely have collapsed. Well, hold on. Oh, it gets even better. Plunging the world economy into a deeper trough. Reviving Glass-Steagall would also break apart America's largest banks, severely diminishing the banking sector's ability to meet the needs of our economy. That was my favorite part right there. And obviously with some of the comments like that were posted, and these are people, just in the general public, putting out comments such as, Mr. Hunter's got some nerve and a bank account to go along to write this. Right. And then you got right here, a banker pleading for banks not to be regulated, writing in the Oklahoman. No propaganda here. So all cynicism aside, right, from the peanut gallery, right, it does show the times that we're in and why what Diane Sare is calling for and what Mr. Linda LaRouche, who she works with as well, is calling for, that we have to actually start getting people to look and orient towards the future. And so what we have done so far with the Diane Sare campaign, as you've seen the radio ads that were posted up a couple of days ago, we intend to have more of this type of exposure because it's obvious and clear that what happened, like the Oklahoman paper incident, is created out of a lot of fear and a lot of defensiveness. And this comes from a lot of activity from activist groups. People with tenacity, such as Diane Sare, is shown to have that type of tenaciousness to intervene in the institutions that need it, right? And so we have to create what we've already started, a juggernaut, right, by the multitudes to put the congressman's feet to the fire. And so this, you will see, has already started Jamie Dimon's freak out, and also the President of the United States, Barack Obama, whom you guys remembered 2 days ago, or it was 3 days ago now, where they had a closed-door meeting on finalizing. Now get this, it was supposed to be closed door, but it's not so much closed door when everybody knows the topic of discussion was finalizing the Dodd-Frank bill. Now, you can put 2 and 2 together. That means no Glass-Steagall. So if anybody out there has any brains, knows that Obama does not want Glass-Steagall. And neither does Jamie Dimon. And so this is why what we're doing now, as what Diane mentioned with Alexander, with the sheets, activist sheets, we have 2 weeks. We want to intensify a campaign to build up to when the Congress come back from recess, which we don't really mean to stop. We want to actually increase this because this kind of pressure creates that type of defensive posture, which we need more of. And so at the end of this meeting, again, I'll remind people that Alex will be going around and collecting the sheets for people. Please sign up. And so today with Diane Sare, accompanied is Bruce Todd, running mate, Lieutenant Governor, and also Jason Ross, working with Linda LaRouche's basement science team. So without further ado, Diane Sare.
Okay, well, I thought it would be useful to start with Detroit because there is a massive disinformation campaign being run by Wall Street about the situation there. And I would like to liberate everyone here from the murderous propaganda. You have probably recently heard Mr. LaRouche say, bankrupt the bastards, meaning Wall Street. Actually, we had a funny debate in Washington because we wanted to have a banner that said bankrupt the bastards, and someone said, well, they might think that you mean poor people. They might not know you mean Wall Street. So then we had the more hilarious idea, because this is a banner that would be up right next to the executive office buildings and the congressional office buildings, which Michael Steger said from San Francisco, said, well, why don't we have a banner that says, bankrupt Wall Street, you bastards. But anyway, so a lot of people, however, when we say we want to bankrupt Wall Street, get nervous. And they say, but my money is invested in Wall Street and I can't afford to lose it. Well,
guess what? When the system crashes, your money ain't going to be worth much. And you'll be much more interested in whether you have food, water, electricity, health care, and transportation, and other things like that. Wall Street is currently, and has been, a useless, foreign interest-run criminal enterprise. And what I'm going to go through in the case of Detroit makes this very clear. Also, if people don't figure out, and this is why Wall Street is running this propaganda campaign, if you don't figure out what's going on in Detroit, you will be next. Because there are cities, Chicago's bonds were downgraded almost 2 days after Detroit. They tried to impose the bankruptcy on Detroit. And then in New Jersey, we have several target cities, Camden, Trenton, Newark, Paterson, Jersey City, all could go this way. So to just give you a sense of this, I thought we could read together a little bit of this New York Times editorial, which goes through what this is. It was called "No Banker Left Behind," and I'm skipping a couple paragraphs at the beginning. And they say, last month, just days before its bankruptcy filing, Detroit reached its first settlement with creditors. The settlement was with UBS, United Bank of Switzerland, and Bank of America, and though the precise terms will not be nailed down until the bankruptcy judge weighs in, Detroit is set to pay an estimated $250 million to terminate a soured derivatives transaction from 2005. The derivatives, known as interest rate swaps, were supposed to protect Detroit from rising interest payments on a chunk of its variable rate debt. The banks would pay Detroit if interest rates rose, and Detroit would pay the banks if the rates fell. By 2009, both interest rates and the city's credit rating were falling, forcing Detroit to pay the banks some $50 million a year and to pledge roughly $11 million a month. Now, what is that in a year? Okay, 11 times 12. In casino revenue as an additional collateral. In the settlement, Detroit will keep the casino tax revenue. It will also reduce its debt load, according to city officials, because the banks have agreed to a discount of as much as 25% of what they are owed, off of what they're owed. But the haircut doesn't mean the banks will suffer. They have already made money on the swaps. The true extent of any discount will not be known until the deal is finalized. This much is clear. The bank's 25% hit is nothing compared with the city's suggested 90% cut to the pension's unfunded liability, which will result in benefit cuts that would be disastrous both in human and political terms, and that the state of Michigan must prevent from happening. This is from the New York Times. So what does this mean? UBS and Bank of America sell Detroit an interest rate swap. Who here remembers LIBOR and the interest rate rigging that we heard about a year ago? Remember that? The banks were lying. Isn't that shocking? The banks were lying. And they were lying about, they were rigging the interest rates. Can you imagine insider trading among banks? I think that's very hard to believe. Now, so we were supposed to believe that the banks would be willing to put themselves possibly at risk to help the poor city of Detroit. Do you think that Bank of America and UBS actually believed for a minute that interest rates were going to rise and they would have to pay the city? I don't think so. So what happened is that the interest rates fell. How shocking. And this cost Detroit $50 million a year. The final total was $343.6 million, okay? So simply by lying, by committing fraud, by doing, in effect, insider trading, the banks extracted $343.6 million from the city of Detroit. Now, what I can't understand is if the banks, through fraud, stole or claimed the city owes them $343.6 million, but now they're only going to get $258 million. How are they losing? I mean, if a guy comes to rob your house, and instead of getting all of your jewelry, he only gets 75% of it, does that mean that the robber is suffering? and for the privilege of being robbed, okay, because they just stole $258 million by lying through fraud. For the privilege of being robbed, the workers of Detroit also get to give the banks 90% of their pensions because the banks are suffering so much from only getting 75% of what they came there to steal. And it means, now the way that the laws were in Detroit is that if you're a city worker, you don't get Social Security because the city paid your pension fund. They didn't pay Social Security taxes. So these retired workers have no other income than their pension. So if they were going to get $1,800 a month, they are now going to get $180 a month to live on for a household. How is that not murder? So I think the only appropriate response is to bankrupt the bastards and put some of them in jail, because that's what you do with people who are thieves and murderers. You put them in jail. So the line that you hear about Detroit being in trouble because of the so-called liberal democratic government of Detroit are just covering up for theft and murder by Wall Street. That's the truth of the matter. Now, on other crimes, because I think it's important to have an idea of the mindset of what we are fighting, what is happening. The destruction of our nation is not an accident. It's not well-intended people who just went awry. The UBS and Bank of America who sold these instruments to Detroit did not just accidentally misbet the interest rates. They were not philanthropists there who were trying to give money to bail out the city of Detroit. They committed fraud knowing that it would kill people, and they didn't care. And people should think back, those of you who remember Enron, if you remember the tapes of the Enron employees and the types of things that they were saying about what they were going to do to the ratepayers in California, or what J.P. Morgan just did to California, because they've somehow become an electricity holding company. So they ripped off California for $162 million with they don't care. You can't steal on this magnitude. You can't cut someone's pension by 90% and not know that you will kill them. This is not an accident. So if you look at the other crime, which I addressed in the radio ads, which is 9/11. And this is really serious right now, because you have a situation where our insane president, Barack Obama, is trying to get us into a war with Syria, which will really be a war with Russia, and which will be thermonuclear. And on 9/11, new evidence has emerged this week that the FBI in Sarasota, Florida, admits that they actually have 15,000 documents which they refused to turn over to the 9/11 Joint Congressional Inquiry, which pertain to a family. I think the guy's name was Al-Ghazawi, who, and then he had a son who was named Al-Hiji. This family lived in a gated community in Sarasota, Florida, and about 3 days before the 9/11 attack, abruptly left their house, leaving food in the refrigerator and things on the stove, abruptly left their house and left the country. Now, it turns out that the records of this gated community show that number one hijacker Mohammed Atta had visited them on numerous occasions, and two other hijackers also had visited them. Now, why this would be relevant, I don't know. It's probably just a coincidence. I mean, that must be what the FBI is saying. None of this could be relevant to the investigations of 9/11. Now, what Lyndon LaRouche said yesterday in his webcast is that there are 3 known and publicly identified perpetrators of 9/11. Number 1, the British monarchy. Number 2, BAE, British Aerospace. Number 3, the Saudis, the Saudi royalty. And Prince Bandar, who has now become the head of Saudi intelligence, was the Saudi ambassador to the United States during 9/11. He was there when W. Bush was president. And it's known, what's publicly known is that he and his wife, Princess Haifa, were channeling tens of thousands of dollars through their Riggs bank account to 2 of the hijackers in San Diego. I don't know, since he was the ambassador, if he had to leave the country, but it should be known that in the days after 9/11, when no one was allowed to fly anywhere, remember all the planes were grounded, the Bush administration arranged for at least 140 Saudis and relatives of Osama bin Laden to fly out of the United States back to Saudi Arabia. And here they are, Prince Bandar and George W. Bush. This is in 2002, August, at the Crawford Ranch of the Bush family. Very close buddies. So and then Obama arranged for Prince Bandar, because the families of the 9/11 victims obviously have had access to what was not redacted material in the joint congressional inquiry. They want to file suit against the Saudis, against Prince Bandar. Well, Obama arranged for Prince Bandar to have diplomatic immunity so he can never be brought to trial. And therefore, he now is the head of Saudi intelligence, where he is free to coordinate all kinds of al-Qaeda activity and so on internationally. So what type of mind would orchestrate or merely go along with or cover up a crime like September 11th, 2001? The same type of mind that would argue that the people of Detroit and the bankers are making an equal sacrifice when the bankers committed fraud and are going to get $258 million, and the people are going to be put out on the street to starve and die. What's the Bush family? Well, Prescott Bush, as people know, was censored by the U.S. Congress for aiding the enemy in a time of war. He funded the Nazis. Then he later became the treasurer of Planned Parenthood because he wanted to make sure that abortions were, too many of the wrong kind of people were getting abortions. The rich white people were getting abortions, but not the poor black people. And Bush wanted to make sure that the undesirable people had access to abortion. So he was the treasurer of Planned Parenthood. And H.W. Bush, his son, later president, got the nickname Rubbers because he was so fanatically committed to population reduction, and had the racist Shockley and Jensen come in and testify in front of his committee in the Congress. And then you had W. Bush, who launched the ethanol program, Turn Your Food into Fuel, another great program to enhance starvation and depopulation. And then, of course, he was followed by Barack Obama, who launched his Nazi Hitler T4 useless eaters health care plan. And I'll just say Ezekiel Emanuel, who is Rahm Emanuel's brother, is allegedly a medical doctor. He actually said, this is not in the Obamacare plan per se, but it's useful to know what informed it, that it's really only worth spending money on health care for people between the ages of 15 and 45. Because if you're under 15 or you're over 45, it's really a risk. It's not that much worth the investment. Now, why have we had this succession of wackos in the White House? Well, who was George Washington's enemy in the American Revolution? And who was the enemy of the United States in the War of 1812? And who actually was the enemy in the so-called Civil War, which you would better call the War of the Rebellion, because the Brits were aiding the Confederacy. And they wanted to recognize the South because they would much rather the United States have been a slave-holding, cotton and tobacco producing colony than an industrialized, developed republic. And that is the enemy today. You could call the British Empire, or thanks to William of Orange, the Dutch takeover of the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire. And today, that is represented by the Queen, who is the head of state of 54 nations, and she has her minions like Tony Blair, who came here to run Barack Obama's second re-election campaign. He was in Chicago most of the time. And Tony Blair was the architect of the weapons of mass destruction. Sorry, go back. That's Blair and Obama. Blair and Bush. The weapons of mass destruction, which people remember. Remember that? Remember 9/11? There was no, the hijackers, 15 of the 19 were from Saudi Arabia. But for some reason, we were supposed to believe that after 9/11, we had to invade Iraq. And they couldn't quite make that connection, so Tony Blair came up with the evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and however many thousands of American and maybe even a million Iraqi lives later, we have found no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But we can thank Tony Blair for giving us the fake evidence to that effect. And now Blair and Obama. And you can see I put who's in charge here, because look at, obviously Blair is running the show. So, how do you defeat this monster? I don't think that's a doctored photograph. Well, impeaching Obama would be a good first step. But the question is, how do we actually win? And that's the question. How do we actually win? Because winning is not just defeating evil. How do you win and get mankind to where mankind should be? So I thought, from that standpoint, we should look at what a previous great president did in a time like today, when fascism was taking over the planet and Wall Street was its agent in the United States. That's FDR, and this is a quote from one of his speeches. He says, "The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism, ownership of government by an individual or a group." Is that not what we have today? Now, when FDR was inaugurated, the official U.S. unemployment was 24.9%. You had people, I read a story, and I don't know if it was Francis Perkins who reported this, but someone reported watching women going through garbage dumps to look for food for their families, and they would take their glasses off so they wouldn't see the maggots going through the meat. And that's what you saw. And then they had all these ways of how you would cook it, and, you know, baking soda or whatever to kill whatever was going to kill you. So it was a totally destitute time. You had thousands of men roaming the country, the hobos, people who were hitchhiking, wandering, jumping on trains, trying to find a day's work anywhere or work just to get food. The day that FDR was inaugurated, 20% of the banks were on holiday. And in several states, the entire state had no banks open. This was March 4th, 1933. So people have heard sections of his inaugural address, most famously the statement that he makes that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But I wanted to play a different segment to give you a sense of what he said he would do and what he actually did.
Restoration calls, however, not for changes in ethics alone. This nation is asking for action, and action now. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war, but at the same time, through this employment, accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use of our great natural resources.
So, putting people to work, that was the mission. So on his second day in office, which was only his first full day in office, Franklin Roosevelt declared a nationwide bank holiday on March 5th, and on March 6th, the third day of being in office, it was a national bank holiday. All the banks across the nation were closed. And the following is from a report. Some of you may have seen this. This is something old that we published in 2003 or 2004, Economics, the End of a Delusion. An article by Richie Freeman. He writes, Roosevelt had to move quickly. That week he met frequently with his financial team led by Treasury Secretary William Wooden, cabinet advisors and representatives from the outgoing Hoover administration, led by former Treasury Secretary Ogden Mills. So he pulled people from the Hoover team and his team immediately together on an emergency basis after declaring the bank holiday. And by midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 a.m. on March 9th, so the banks were closed on March 6th, by some time in the middle of the night going into the morning of March 9th, they had hammered out legislation called the Emergency Banking Act. And it set up 3 classifications of banks for action. Banks that were sound and could reopen under their own power. Banks that would require capital from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And banks that a conservator would liquidate. So at noon, on March 9th, okay, probably 12 hours after this, 12 noon, President Roosevelt sent a message to the Congress, quote, I cannot too strongly urge the Congress to the clear necessity for immediate action. And then a historian, Leuchtenberg, described the scene. Shortly before 1 p.m., so noon he announces it, by 1 p.m. the whole Congress is called back in. Roosevelt's banking message was read, while some newly elected congressmen were still trying to find their seats. The House of Representatives had no copies of the bill. The Speaker of the House recited the text from the one available draft, which bore last-minute corrections on it in pencil. According to the record, Bertrand Snell, the Republican floor leader, said, quote, the House is burning down and the President of the United States says this is the way to put out the fire, unquote. The House voted unanimously for the Emergency Banking Act. Then the Senate voted for it by 73-7. The Senate adjourned at 7:52 p.m. Roosevelt signed the law at 8:37 p.m. The entire affair, from the first introduction to the final signature, was done in 8 hours. So, anyone who says we can't pass Glass-Steagall, you can't take emergency action in a timely manner, this entire thing, they didn't even have copies of the bill. It was read, and they voted on it and passed it within 8 hours. Now, this may not surprise you, but Wall Street was not that cooperative with the New Deal. So, and what they did, which will also sound familiar, is the banks all cut back lending. They cut back lending to the economy. So FDR decided he had to do something to take on Wall Street because, like today, the crash was blamed not on the millionaire bankers or billionaire bankers in their $1 million suits. Why, they're obviously respectable and know what they're doing. It's all those lazy people in the auto plants and the General Electric and the farmers. I mean, they're all the lazy ones who don't want to work, and that's what's causing this problem. So what FDR did was he decided that he would work with the Senate Banking Committee and its chief counsel, Ferdinand Pecora, who, as you might gather from these two pictures, was a very feisty Sicilian immigrant, Republican, not that tall and infamous for having a cigar that was almost larger than he was. And what he did was he put Wall Street on trial, which was absolutely crucial because otherwise none of the massive public works projects, the Rural Electrification Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, none of this would have been allowed to go through. I mean, they literally argued that you could not, against the Rural Electrification Administration, that it was a waste of money to bring electricity to farmhouses because you needed too much copper wire. And anyone who knows anything about agriculture, if you know of the orders of magnitude that production was increased by having electricity, I mean, not to mention, I mean, like everything, this was insane. So Wall Street had to be put under control. And so Pecora hauled everyone because it was in the Senate and not in front of a private judge where these billionaires would have been able to buy their way out of the court. That's why it had to be in the Senate. It had to be public. So Jack Morgan, the son of J.P. Morgan, was called in, and Pecora asked him if he had paid U.S. income taxes. Morgan said, "I cannot remember." After repeated questioning and consultation with his attorney, Morgan allowed us how he had not paid taxes in 1930 or 1931 or 1932. It was then disclosed that dozens of Morgan partners, each of them multimillionaires, so dozens of multimillionaires had paid collectively less than $50,000 in taxes in 1930, and by 1931 they had succeeded in paying zero. This didn't sit well with a nation in which 1 out of 4 workers was officially unemployed and where people were starving. So Jack Morgan Jr. went to jail. He was sentenced to prison. I believe 6 months was what he served. The other thing that they discovered, which reminded me very much of today's House Financial Services Committee, where you have freshmen in the Congress, if they get a seat on the House Financial Services Committee, they have double the money in their campaign coffers of the average congressman anywhere else. Can't imagine why that would be. And Morgan, it turns out, had a so-called preferred list. And people on the list would get to purchase stock that was valued at $35 to $37 for $20 a share. So on this list were people like the former President Calvin Coolidge, who had much more to do with creating the Depression than Hoover did, John J. Raskob, who had been the head of the Democratic Party, who had tried fanatically and desperately to stop FDR from getting the nomination, and others. So once Wall Street was either behind bars or thoroughly discredited, agencies like the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, CWA, the Public Works Administration, PWA, were able to launch thousands of local and several massive public infrastructure projects, which directly put over 4 million Americans to work, and an additional 4 million Americans to work because the people who were employed this way needed to be serviced, needed material, etc. So there was a multiplier factor. Some of you have probably heard of the 4 quarters project, Bob, which has the Grand Coulee Dam in the northwest, the Hoover Dam and the Colorado River Project, the St. Lawrence Seaway, which actually didn't get built during FDR's time, was built in the 1950s, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority is fascinating because it was a couple dozen dams, levees, massive hydroelectric power, but also logically, and you'll hear more of this from Bruce and Jason, that became the location for groundbreaking work in nuclear power, because that's the way these things work, is you leap. You go from one level of technology to the next. Now, I wanted to talk about the Grand Coulee Dam for a second, because that makes this picture very clear. This dam contains 10.5 million cubic yards of concrete, and at that time, that was the most concrete in any single structure anywhere in the world. I think the Three Gorges Dam may have now surpassed that. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation paid for the dam to be built, which meant purchasing the steel and concrete, but who produced that? Who produced the heavy equipment? And that's where you get the multiplier effect, so that you had to purchase the material for this, and that employed millions more people. This dam produced so much energy so cheaply that it cost only 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So all of a sudden, Alcoa and Kaiser aluminum companies and Boeing all wanted to move into Washington State, where they are to this day, because if you were a heavy industrial manufacturing company, you want cheap, reliable energy. So it had all kinds of multiplier effects. Now, for all the capitalists who think FDR was a communist socialist, let me just tell you a couple other things. Under FDR, between 1939 and 1944, the average wage level per worker doubled, and corporate profits increased by 4.5 times. In 1938, the U.S. produced 34,000 machine tools, and by 1942, it was 307,000 machine tools. And the machine tools produced in 1942 were also that much more powerful because you had the advantage of breakthroughs in science, so people were using more advanced tools and an order of magnitude more of them. Now, think about, and you'll hear, as I said, from Jason and from Bruce after me, what would be the implications for launching what we're talking about, the thermonuclear NWAPA. If you think about what happened with the 4 quarters projects of FDR and what that did to build the U.S. economy, the employment, the profit rates of the population by orders of magnitude, how much of a leap would you get today using nuclear power, thermonuclear power, and doing things that are even bigger and continent-wide? So, in closing, I would like it known that I think we are close to victory. Impeachment is becoming a more and more commonly heard word in the halls of Congress. And I don't think that desperate bank lobbyists would be flying from Delaware and Maryland down to Atlanta, Georgia, where I had the firsthand experience of watching them chasing state legislators down the halls and threatening them to try and stop them from passing a Glass-Steagall resolution. I don't think they would be reduced to this kind of desperation unless they were truly desperate. And as Dana mentioned earlier, the banker who responded to Paul Gallagher in the Oklahoman is the head of the American Bankers Association. Why is the head of the American Bankers Association writing editorials for the Oklahoman? You would think, okay, maybe the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Times or the New York Times. They are so freaked out that, you know, probably if the local Rutgers University newspaper had an article on Glass-Steagall, Jamie Dimon would feel like he had to respond. So the truth is, for the empire and their Wall Street toadies, They cannot win. The crash is inevitable. The question is, will the crash be on their terms, where it becomes thermonuclear war and a fascist dictatorship where people are starving in the streets? Or will it be a preemptive bankruptcy where you put through Glass-Steagall, wipe out the rotten speculative garbage, and create the conditions for a bright future for billions of human beings? So, as I said, I think we can win. And the reason that I'm running for governor and the reason that you are here is because in order to win, we have to fight.
And next up, Bruce Todd.
Thank you. I'm going to give a brief description of nuclear power, but first I'd like to go back to what Diane said about Detroit, because for most people that don't know, Detroit was once the 5th largest city in the United States. And because of its productive capability, not just in Detroit, but the entire region, you had a living standard that was the highest in the world. And that living standard has been collapsed to the point of virtually, you could call it a third world nation sitting inside the geographic limits of the United States. Now, what's important about Detroit was its productive capability. Now, nuclear power fits right into that in a couple of ways. For people that don't know how nuclear power works, I'll just briefly go through it. You have a pressure vessel, because I've worked in a number of nuclear plants, both here in New Jersey and elsewhere, of different types and different sizes. I live in the shadow of a nuclear plant, actually, in Ocean County, the Oyster Creek nuclear plant, which is in fact scheduled to be shut down very shortly, as a number of other plants have already been shut down and dismantled. And in fact, if you look at the history of nuclear power, many of our plants, although they've reached a time span where recently they've had to undergo major changes. So in a sense, you could say they're starting to reach their maximum range of usefulness. There are now, on the drawing boards, different types of nuclear power plants, 4th generation power plants, which could easily replace them, maybe not even in the same place. Most of the type I'm talking about are both meltdown proof, much more efficient. Consequently, they could even be located in the middle of a major city like New York City, if you wanted, very safely, very efficiently. But in any case, the ones I've worked on require, fuel rods, what's called a fuel rod. If you want to think about it real simply, a nuclear power plant, the reactor vessel, is a big teapot. That's all it is, except that you don't have your energy source for producing steam, which is how it operates, is not outside, it's inside. And inside that are fuel rods. And the control of those fuel rods are regulated by a type of material which, by either integrating it with the fuel rods or pulling it out of the fuel rods, will determine how much reaction you have going on in the vessel. Out of that, all you're basically doing is producing steam. In a boiling water reactor, like by where I live, that steam goes directly from the reactor to your turbines, turns your turbine blades, and at the end of that, you have your electrical generator. And that's where you're getting your electricity from. Now, in a pressure water reactor like we have in Salem, Salem 1 and Salem 2, because we have 4 plants in New Jersey, Hope Creek is another boiling water reactor. But in those types, you have what's called a primary loop and a secondary loop. Your primary loop is in the terms in the nuclear industry is your dirty loop, because it involves radioactive, coming in contact with radiation. Even though one of the purposes is to keep the water as clean as possible, right? Because you don't want to have different parts of the plant, either the piping or your turbine blades, become very radioactive, because you do have to do maintenance on them. They have to be fully disassembled, and I'm talking huge units, the size of this, this room here, would be a half. You'd have another half underneath. You pull them apart, and your turbines, which are just a shaft with blades on them, to take that steam and turn them, into the power necessary to drive your generator. So you want to be able to work on them, because I've worked on many of them. Even inside, like I say, a boiling water reactor. On a pressure water reactor, that secondary loop, your primary water goes through a huge series of radiators. And what you're doing is taking the steam from your primary loop and you're transferring it, turning steam in a clean loop. So now you have your piping, your turbines, and everything else is clean. No radioactivity involved. So it's much easier to work on. So that's really the essence of how a nuclear power plant works. I mean, yeah, there's lots of piping. There's lots of electronics. The electronics alone is comparable to what you would think of involving the space program, because you have a series of backups. Most plants have 3 backups, 3 series of safety backups in all systems, so that if one fails, you have a backup to that, and if that one fails, you have a backup to that. And you also have emergency systems to be able to bring your reactor down from an operating mode down to an idle mode. So it's an extremely safe system. And as I said, when you get into your newer generations, they're even safer still. Now, the reason they went so early on to nuclear power is because of its efficiency. Compared to burning wood or burning coal or anything even above that, there's no comparison in its capability. And if you want to talk about solar energy, you're even talking even lower than that. So for any our nation or any other nation to be roped into this idea of solar energy is totally incomprehensible. And let me even make that a little bit clearer, using the issue of the sun. Because if you take the sun, which is 96 million miles away, focused on Earth, right, and you take say a square meter, right, the amount of energy after 96 million miles reaching that collector, solar collector, is how diffuse. How diffuse is that possible? Now let's take thermonuclear fusion. Let's bring that sun down here, because that's what we're doing with thermonuclear reactors. You're taking the power of the sun, a dynamic process, in fact, a process which most people call a fourth state of matter, because you're dealing with an energetic, dynamic plasma. And the whole purpose of developing this next generation, beyond what's the fourth generation of normal nuclear reactors, is a reactor whose sole purpose is to take the same process that goes on the sun, self-organizing process, creating its own magnetic fields, and create the conditions here, man-made magnets, and identifying the different activities that go on, and attempting to moderate them in a way that you can make it useful. Now, let me give you an idea of that, because if you go to the plasma reactor down in Princeton, if you're standing here and that reactor is operating, you're here at room temperature. But if you go on the other side of that wall, the temperature is 500 million degrees. Right? So now that's the energy potential you're dealing with, and the capability to figure out ways of drawing that off, either through direct electrical energy or other means, is really what's ahead as far as, you know, the next Apollo project, if you will, because that's where we need to go. Now, Diane can tell you, she's visited there, and they will tell you that at the rate that it's being funded now, because of budget constraints, they'll never get there. They'll never take that capability of researching and developing that as a functioning, usable reactor and never be able to make it commercially feasible. And that's really one of the tasks ahead of us here, you know, because that is the potential. It's not just energy even, because just like when they started the development of nuclear energy, one of the speeches Kennedy gave before the Congress was, we have to develop a nuclear spacecraft, which in fact they were in the process of developing back in the 60s. And when they extrapolated its rate of development and where it might fit in to going to Mars, because that was potentially probably the best option, they figured we'd be on Mars by 1984 using that technology. And if you take the potential for thermonuclear fusion and extrapolate that into usable technology for spacecraft, you know, as Mr. LaRouche has said, you could have a 1G gravity spacecraft that could potentially move at a continuing 1 gravity, that making possible travel from not here, because it's a little bit different, but from somewhere like the moon, which is where we should have been already, and moving from there to Mars in, I think, approximately 1 week's time. So that's the potential. That's what's being sat on right now. So that's really where we need to be going. And if you take, now let me get a little bit back to Detroit. Because if you go back to Detroit, what was it in places like Camden and you know, other places like Patterson? What were they? They were the industrial capability to make available the basis to do things like take nuclear power and make it standardized, which would cheapen the cost. That was one of the major problems with it. It was never standardized. It's like everybody having a different Model T, you know. That's really the way the nuclear industry ended up. But if it was ever standardized such that all your manufacturers could be, you know, producing the same thing, and you had interchangeability, which you never had in to a large extent in the nuclear industry, even the cost of what they say is astronomical now could have been massively brought down, right? So that's really where Detroit, or say Camden. Let me just make it one more point with Camden. Because if we're going to deliver, if we're going to produce, because right now we can't even produce the major components for nuclear power plants. But if we could, and if we wanted to transport them, say, to somewhere else, one of the best ways to do that is by shipping. So what is Camden? Well, Camden at one time was the biggest shipyard in the world, sitting right here. It was also the shipyard that produced the first nuclear-powered transport vessel, shipping vessel, you know, beyond the Navy, what the Navy did with, you know, aircraft carriers, submarines, things like that. But that's what Camden did. That's the history of places that existed here in New Jersey, that existed in places like Detroit and Ohio. out on the West Coast. And this is what we have to bring back, because what you're talking about is tens of millions of high-wage, skilled jobs, right? So I'll leave it at that.
All right, next, Jason Ross.
All right, let me start by thanking Diane for inviting me here. It's good to be here. So I want to address how it is that we're going to be leaping into the future. A lot of this is in the direction that Bruce just spoke about the future of power, both fission and then eventually into fusion. And some of the specific projects we're working on right now on revamping a project called NWAPA. As a general approach, we have to think about moving forward in leaps. You can't nudge yourself forward. People might say, well, the economy is very bad, so we can't afford very much. So as was brought up about Princeton plasma physics, say, well, we don't have enough money, so we'll just give you enough to never do anything. Isn't that nice? At least we kept some money in the budget, you know? It would probably cost more to shut you down and disassemble everything. So here you go. Here's enough to keep you going. You know, it's like you've got a contractor building a building, and you only give him enough money to, you know, pay his payroll and never buy any of the supplies. Building's never going to get built. So because we've got a complete economic collapse, that should be pretty liberating in recognizing that we can change dramatically the way the economy's run, because it's completely wrong right now. So let's have a complete change. Who likes it the way it is? So a big shift is in order. Let me start. Let's look at the. I want to start with a quote from Vladimir Vernadsky, who is a Russian-Ukrainian bio-geo-noochemist. He did it all. And this is from a paper that he wrote in 1925 when he was living in France. And it's a precursor to his later concept of the noosphere. So you might recognize this quote. Vernadsky said that man is profoundly distinguished from the other organisms by his action on the environment. This distinction, which was great from the beginning of mankind, has become immense with the passage of time. The action of other organisms is almost exclusively determined by their growth and increase, by their physical bodies. Mankind certainly acts in the same way, but his mass is completely negligible in comparison with the totality of living matter, and its direct manifestations of his nutrition and body are almost nothing. Reason changes all. Through it, man utilizes material in the environment, inanimate or living, not only for the building of his body, but also for social life. And this usage has become a great geological force. Thought, by its existence, introduces into the crustal mechanisms a powerful process having no analog before the appearance of man. So he recognized that among the physical principles that are out there, you know, you look at geology, the formation of different layers of rocks, you look at the motion of the planets around the sun, you understand electricity, magnetism, things like this. He said the power of thought, that is something that you can study as a scientist. It's a force in the universe. We are a force of nature, just like these other ones, and increasingly much more powerful than any of these other ones, despite the small size of our cells and our bodies. If you think of a coral reef being formed, that's actually bodies of coral. Sort of a gruesome image, but if we were trying to build our houses out of bones, sorry, that's totally disgusting, but we don't do that, right? Our bodies are insignificant to what we do. They really don't matter. They don't matter. Now, there's some people, by that I mean British people, who have said that this progress of ours will reach its end. You may have heard of Thomas Malthus. Anybody heard of Malthus? Right. He said, I don't know where he pulled this, well, I can imagine where he pulled it out of. He said that while population growth is geometric, the productivity of the land only increases arithmetically. That's just not true, but that's what he said. But now, I want to read a quote from an American who wrote a book on economic development in 1879. He said, if bears, instead of men, had been shipped from Europe to the North American continent, there would now be no more bears than in the time of Columbus. But within the limits of the United States alone, there are now 45 million men where there were only a few 100,000. And yet there is now within that territory much more food per capita for the 45 million than there was for the few 100,000. Is not the increase of food? It is not the increase of food that has caused the increase of men, but the increase of men that has caused the increase of food. There is more food because there are more men. The other thing he didn't mention is that the first Thanksgiving probably would have been the bears eating the Indians. So anyway, history would have been profoundly changed if the bears came over on the Mayflower. So this outlook of Malthus, it's just wrong. It's not how things happen. We're not consumers of things that are around us, like we're walking through the Garden of Eden and just, having a nectarine or something. We produce our food. So let's take a look at one of the amazing ways that we can change the earth for our benefit to make more food. And it's called NWAPA. NWAPA is the North American Water and Power Alliance. It was first proposed in the 1960s by an American engineering firm, and it calls for bringing water from Canada and Alaska into the United States, into the Southwest, and partially also into northern Mexico. This program would have doubled the agricultural land in Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, significantly introduced it in other states. It would also have called for the construction of some of the basically the largest dams the world had ever seen, the largest pumping station ever. It would create millions of jobs, and these jobs would be productive. Not just getting people to work and enjoying the fresh air, although that's good too, but this would dramatically increase our ability to have a stable supply into the future and not depend on the whims of the weather. Let's take a look at the next one. So this is sort of Canada's on the right, there's Baja California on the left. So this is the motion of the water through the system, and you see an elevation chart here. So as the water is moving from 5 to 7, you see a very large pump labeled as number 6 there in Idaho. This pumping system, as it was designed at the time in the 60s, uses as much electrical power as the entire state of New Jersey does today. It's a pretty big system, but there's actually going to use even more now. Let's take a look at the next. Okay, yeah, there's the figures. Okay, let's go to the next one. Oh, let's go back one. Now, we're going to update this. The NWAPA 21 system, the updated NWAPA, as LaRouche PAC has been developing, calls for some changes. One of them is that to get all of that pumping power, about half of the water that's collected is just let go into the ocean through hydro dams to make the electricity to then pay for the pumping. If we use nuclear plants, we can keep all that water. We don't have to let it go to the sea. We'll have twice as much water available for distribution. So now you're looking at increasing the amount of water in Arizona or New Mexico by 4 times. Think about all the extra food you can make. Because there's plenty of water. I mean, water in Alaska and northern Canada, it's really hard to do very much good with it. Plants need a couple of different things. One of them is water. The other one is sunshine. Yeah, that's not the sunniest place on the planet. It's not that warm. It's hard to grow when it's freezing. You're definitely not going to have cherry trees and things like that. So let's go ahead and let's look at some of the other differences. This is a chart of average wind flow and moisture flow through the atmosphere. So this is the whole planet we're looking at. And you can see those little arrows give an idea of the net flow. So over the United States, wind flows from the west to the east generally. That's how weather systems move. That's how the water moves. In other places, look at the northern part of South America. The wind moves the opposite way, from the east to the west, on the two sides of the equator. Let's take a look at the next one, because there's a problem in the United States, or in North America rather. You can see the dark blue color represents the amount of rainfall. So there's plenty of rain on the East Coast and the southeast for sure. In the central part of the country, there's almost none. It's very dry. And there's a huge amount on the Pacific coast. All that rain is landing on the Pacific coast. It's not moving inland. It goes right out to the ocean. So why is all that rain staying there? There's a mountain range, the Rocky Mountains. So that's keeping the water from being able to move any further. Let's take a look at the next one. here you got a chart. This is the photosynthetic activity on the North American continent. So you can see along the Pacific coast in the northern part, the northwest, oh, red is less and then purple is more. There's very little plant life going on up there. Plenty of water, but no sunshine. In in New Mexico, Arizona, there's obviously plenty of sunshine and no water. But then you see, in the eastern part of the country, the transition from green to yellow is where you might officially say the western states begin. There's what's called the 20-inch rainfall line, where if you go further west than that, it's just hard to have productive crops. So if we can change this arbitrary distribution of water on the continent, because let's face it, there's nothing particularly great about nature if it's not good. I mean, having a drought, you don't say, well, that's just how nature wanted it, and that's beautiful. And we should really appreciate that and enjoy being thirsty. And frankly, AstroTurf lawns look great. And it's okay if we don't have any food. That's just how it is this year. Or floods. We can say, what a beauty. I am in touch with the god of rain. All this moisture is great for my rotting basement. No. Just because things are a certain way doesn't mean they're any good. Part of this environmentalist thing is that instead of protecting the environment so that it's good for people, it's just become anti-human. That whatever it's like, if we don't do anything, that's how it should be. That's just saying people shouldn't exist. Or we should at least exist as little as possible. Try not to be noticed, Let's go ahead and look at the next one. So this is a chart worldwide, this is interesting, about how much of the rain that falls came from water that evaporated over land. It's a funny concept. For example, you see if you look at China, look at Mongolia. Basically, all the rain that's landing in Mongolia evaporated over land. Water on the land evaporated, and then that rained in Mongolia. They're not getting any from the oceans. Look at the United States. On the west coast, all the rain that falls there evaporated from the ocean and then fell on the land. We can obviously make more use of some of this water. Let's take a look at the next one. Here you get of water evaporating from the land, how much is going to then fall back onto the land. I'm just showing these to make the point that there's a wide variety in the world, and we shouldn't think there's anything so special about the way North America is right now if it stinks, which it does. Look at the next one here. So let's talk about power. So Bruce already addressed a lot of this. The implications of a new NWAPA system today would be that we'd have twice as much water because we won't have to use any for hydropower, and also the potential to use nuclear techniques in construction. For example, the peaceful use of nuclear bombs for building tunnels, for example. I mean, some of these tunnels are, 60 miles long. So if you're building a tunnel and you got a tunnel boring machine on each side and they're moving towards each other, they're only going to get there but so fast, and it's not very fast. These things don't move very quickly. There were a lot of studies done in a program called Operation Plowshare, part of the Atoms for Peace that was launched by Eisenhower, where the use of shaped atomic charges, reasonably small ones, fission bombs, was studied to be able to actually, punch holes through for building of tunnels, for building of canals. There were plans for decades to build the Kra Canal in Thailand using peaceful nuclear explosions because it moves things so much quicker. That's a potential for us now. It's a potential for us now overall, using the NWAPA approach as sort of a guide for where we want to go as an economy. To say, let's build a huge project that's going to employ millions of people, that'll make us more productive, that'll make us more independent from the whims of nature, that'll greatly improve our food supply. Let's also move forward on fusion. If not now, when? Remember, because things are so bad, it means we need to have very large changes. So if we're developing fusion power, if we're finally putting together that stellarator that Princeton Plasma Physics Lab built, and then they just don't have the money to put the two halves together, which is where the Obama administration has left them, we can really move forward by some leaps. Take a look at this. This is electrical generation per capita in the United States. You can't see the years, they go from 1950 to today. Well, actually, if it continued to today, it would have gone down further. You can see, through our recent history, through the past half century, the amount of electricity per capita overall has gone from 2,000 to a level of about 14,000. But look at the rate of growth. Can you see when it's starting to slow down? Let's also break it down by power source in the next graph here. Oh, well, this is interesting too. Electricity is making up more and more of our total energy use, in addition to, petroleum or gas for heating or for industry. Next one? Okay, here we go. So take a look at this. In terms of our overall energy use, not just electricity, but any kind of energy. In the 1700s, what do you use for energy? Wood. That's what you have. All right, then you see how once you've got coal, the wood seems a little bit less appealing. Right? Coal burns hotter. It's at a certain point you're going to run out of trees. Actually, this is interesting. I heard the statistic for the state of Pennsylvania that the over 50%, in fact, I think actually a large majority of the forests currently in Pennsylvania didn't exist 150 years ago. They were all cut down to build houses and to burn the wood. Now, these trees, they're obviously, if they're getting cut down faster than they're growing again, you're going to run out of wood, which is actually the direction things went. So you can see with the introduction of coal. Now, an environmentalist back then might have said, whoa, if we run out of trees, we're dead, so let's die slowly and just, reduce our use of wood. Now, forget it. We have coal. Then wood can be used for building houses instead of burning. Then you've got petroleum, natural gas. You got nuclear, which, it started and then it never really got anywhere. I mean, today, this is for total energy. For electricity, it's about 25% of U.S. production. But why didn't it take off? If it had, we wouldn't be using, it's really stupid to be using petroleum the way that we do. Like, look for a piece of plastic near you. That came from petroleum. Okay? You actually make things out of petroleum. You make plastics out of petroleum. Burning it is about as sensible as burning wood when you could be using it to build something. Or burning food, which we're also doing. Taking perfectly good corn that didn't do anything wrong to you and then burning it. Let's take a look at what should have happened. So imagine if these kinds of shifts that we saw had continued the way past developments in our economy had. We didn't have environmentalists complain, in the back earlier. You can see where we would have gone with fission, with fusion. I mean, even just with fission, you would expect today's per capita energy usage to be about 3 times what it is right now, if the trend up until the 60s had continued. 3 times as much per capita, both because it stopped growing and because each person's using less. But this isn't where we went. Let's take a look at the next one. Okay. So here's an overall chart. This is human population. And it seems to be, it's shooting up, right? World population has been zooming upwards. But let's take a look at a slightly more recent time period. Let's take a look at the next one. This is from the U.S. Census Bureau. Okay? Take a look at that. World population growth rates. Look where we are. About 1%. In the early 60s, 2%. So in the past 50 years, the rate of population growth has dropped in half. It's already happening. People saying the world's population is growing too fast, we've got to slow it down. That's already happening. All right? That's exactly what the policies we've got right now were intended to do, and that's what they're succeeding in doing. They're reducing the growth of the population. So think about the overall... Let's go to the next one, just get the black screen. So we got a problem with this supposedly environmentalist outlook. It's better just called anti-human, because it's really not about the environment. It's about removing people, and it uses supposed concern about the environment as a way of making their point. But that's not the real point. The point is to prevent human society from developing and from being free from oligarchical rule. The threat to the empire has been developing nations. Why did Britain want to keep the colonies weak? It's much easier to keep them in control. Same as look at their policy anywhere else. And now there is this, I forget if it was Time or Newsweek, had the article about a child-free lifestyle. It sounds like, I don't know, like not eating carbs, or, if you put agave syrup in your coffee because, you didn't want to use sugar, but now you heard NutraSweet's bad, so now you're going to use agave or something. I'm sugar-free, child-free. Now, supposedly it's about your own children. That, hey, if you don't have any kids, you shouldn't feel bad about it. You're just living a child-free life. It's like, you don't eat meat or something. But it's really about other children. It's saying overall, let's be a child-free society. If we don't have children, they won't grow up, we'll have less people, and that's the future we should head towards. Basically, what we really need to move towards, we need to have concern for our world, and we need to be, very forward-thinking and go extinct. That's really what we need to aspire to. Don't use any energy. Leave no carbon footprint. Don't let your children leave carbon footprints. In fact, don't let them have feet. Don't give birth to them in the first place. And if they're born, maybe we could turn them into gasoline. Maybe that'll be the next thing. Now, Thomas, Swift wrote about that, but it's, as a joke, but that's, don't give these guys ideas. So overall, we've got to reject this prevailing, it's just everywhere. Everywhere. You can't turn around without some product, talking about how green it is, like you care, or making you, it's everywhere. That's got to be rejected. We have got a very beautiful human species that has got the potential. Every person, every child born anywhere on this planet could be that genius who discovers how to control AIDS, cancer, makes a breakthrough in fusion, antimatter. Some child that could have done that, but who died of starvation, they might have been born last week and then died this week. So we need to have a plan for the future. I think we've been laying one out. The NWAPA 21 is a way of putting it together as a specific project for the United States, at the least, to give a very direct direction for where we're going, and coupled with the breakthroughs we need to make in fusion to continue that trend of qualitative leaps in our power, the future can be almost unimaginable. But we're going to have to eliminate this oligarchical outlook politically with Glass-Steagall, through removing Obama, and also it's around. It's in the air. And you cannot be afraid to fight against that and root it out in yourself, to the extent you might be thinking, yeah, but isn't there just something wrong about moving that water? Isn't there something unholy about doing that? I don't know. That's like, defacing the temple or something. It isn't. This is our world, and we need to make it a much better one. Thanks.